Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. Welcome to Garden Basics Greatest Hits Volume 2. You know, time flies when you're having fun, and we are having a blast bringing you the great gardening advice and information twice a week since April of 2020. This episode features the top 7 most listened to segments of the last 100 episodes, from episode 100 to episode 199, as determined by you, the listeners, my garden-loving friends. Thank you so much for hitting the play button week after week. I appreciate it. Over the last 40 years of doing garden shows on Northern California radio stations, as well as the Garden Basics podcast since the great COVID lockdown, I have enjoyed talking to some of the most knowledgeable garden experts in the country, with special thanks to my local gardening friends. People like our favorite retired college horticulture professor Debbie Flower, nursery owners like Don Shore, Chris Aycock, Juliet Voigtlander, and Julia Oldfield, soils expert Steve Zion, a host of master gardeners such as Pam Bone, Gail Pothauer, Lorianne Asmus, and Quentin Young, fruit tree experts Phil Purcell, Tom Spellman, and Ed Livo, UC Davis Arboretum Superintendent Emeritus Warren Roberts, master rosarians like Charlotte Owendike and Debbie Arrington, the double threat of a master rosarian and bug expert Baldo Villegas, outdoor power equipment shop owner Brad Gay, and fellow garden podcaster Marlene Simon, and so many more. Friends who I've just ticked off because I forgot them. Oh yeah, let's not forget the yappy mascots of Barking Dog Studios, the household rescue pups, the brother and sister snack-seeking team of Salty and Pepper. And well, since we're in big awards mode here, I'd like to thank my accountant, who has been with me since the Carter administration, who also happens to be my wife, Jeannie. Thank you. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon jungle in suburban Purgatory. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, brought to you today, as always, by 2 garden companies who have stuck by me throughout all these gardening broadcast and podcast adventures, Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. And since this is a very special episode featuring very popular chats about tomatoes and berries, garden design, composting, soils, and of course mulch, we will attempt to do it all in under 60 minutes. 60 minutes, really. I'm going to keep it under 60 minutes. Thank you for indulging me. Let's go. Well, it's Garden Basics, the Greatest Hits, Part 2, the most listened to segments between episodes 100 and 199. No surprise that on several of the segments that we'll be playing for you today, they feature America's favorite retired college horticultural professor, Debbie Flower. Debbie is here to talk a little bit about each of these outstanding episodes that got listened to by you, and thank you so much for listening. And by the way, if you care about statistics, it's all about downloads, unique listeners, and time consumed listening. So thank you for that again. Debbie, one of the episodes that got a lot of listeners was the episode that we recorded live at the Folsom Garden Club a few months back. And that was quite the experience. That was fun.
It was fun. It's fun to be in front of a live audience.
And they had questions. We answered their questions, and we prattled on about spring garden tips.
Yes.
And I wonder which one stuck with them. We don't know.
Oh, boy. Good question.
Yeah. I would say, what would you say? What would be the one spring garden tip that you would want them to remember?
I want to say mulch. Mulch to conserve water, mulch to improve your soil, mulch to keep your weeds down. It's so useful. Unless you're growing a cactus garden or a alpine garden, it's so useful. It does so many wonderful things for the garden. In spring, when it's still comfortable outside, temperature-wise, humidity-wise, whatever, in your part of the country, is a good time to apply that mulch.
Spring Garden Tips Live. Let's give a listen. That brings up a very good point about a spring garden chore that you all should be doing to preserve more soil moisture, because who knows where the next step in water restrictions is going to be. Probably going from 2 days a week to 1 day a week would be my guess. But you can train your soil to retain more water, so it will be happy with 1 irrigation a week, maybe even less. And that's by a combination of adding compost to your soil and then mulching the top with several inches of an organic mulch. What are some of your favorite mulches?
I chase down arborists. I woke up one morning and heard a saw. Okay, that's a saw. Heard it again. Yeah, that's a chainsaw. Then I heard the chipper go. Jumped out of bed, made myself presentable, got in the car, and drove around the neighborhood till I found the arborist and said, can I have those chips? And I have a place in my yard where they're piled. I have a pile right now, and I move them around. And I've done this for many years. There are certain plants I cannot grow because my soil is so water retentive. So that's something to consider.
She came to brag.
And I lost some things too. It's called Phytophthora. It's a disease that builds up when moisture. It's a disease in the soil that enters the plant when moisture is around, like the trunk of the plant. I lost some California wax myrtles to Phytophthora because of my mulching practice. Mounds would help that. If you have things that you want to, I have a ceanothus, but it's on a mound, so it doesn't get the mulch around it. So it's not that. You have to think a little bit differently. But I spread it every year. And weeding, take those weeds out, take those things out that are sucking up the water. Did a lot of that this weekend. And then put the mulch down.
My neighbors love me because every fall, November, December, I knock on their door and I say, can I rake up your oak leaves for you? And they go, why, are you crazy? Yeah, go ahead, sure. Well, I do. I gather up all the oak leaves in the neighborhood. I put them in a metal trash can. Remember the metal 32-gallon trash cans? They're still for sale. And I will fill it halfway. Then I will stick my string trimmer down there and grind up the leaves. Or I'll take my mulching mower and run over those leaves, making them more fine particles. And that's my mulch. I will put that 6-8 inches deep on top of all my raised beds and let it stay there all winter. It feeds the soil as it breaks down. It keeps the soil warmer. It does a whole host of good.
Protects the soil. When rain comes down on bare soil, it's so powerful that it can cause soil compaction. So if you cover it with something, you don't get that soil compaction.
And it's building up better soil biology, too. All the little critters in the soil that are actually feeding your plants. I think this is one reality that more and more people are coming to see, is that you don't feed your plants. You feed the soil. And then the soil feeds the plant. There's a lot of mycorrhizal activity down below the root level where these critters are taking the nutrients from the soil, converting it into a way that the plant roots can assimilate. And by encouraging more mycorrhizal soil activity, by feeding your soil on a slow, regular basis with something like a mulch, you're improving your soil 100%.
And then if you go dig in it, if you've done the mulch and you dig in it and you turn it over and there's white stuff, that's the beneficial fungus. Don't freak out. That's good stuff. Yeah.
To no one's surprise, many of the top listened to segments over the last 100 episodes had to do with tomatoes. And in many situations, the tomato questions we get here require us to dispel some popular myths that circulate through social media and the internet every spring. And the myth that seems to circulate the most in the springtime regarding tomatoes has to do with the alleged benefits of pruning tomato plants soon after planting time. Should you be picking off tomato flowers in the spring? Should you be pruning back the plant in April and May in order to get a bigger crop down the line? Or to get tomatoes sooner? One of our favorite mythbusters on the podcast is Sacramento County Master Gardener and vegetable expert Gail Pothauer. We caught up with her at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center in Sacramento County, and her answer? It's a rousing, it depends. George writes in and asks, does picking off the immature flowers encourage or discourage future crop production of tomatoes? The tomato plants are 6 inches tall. We get this question every spring. People read somewhere, usually it's online, that picking off the early flowers on a tomato plant will give you more tomatoes later on. True or false?
It depends. If you're growing a determinate tomato and you start picking off the flowers, you're going to be reducing your yield because determinate tomato varieties only have a certain number of flowers that they produce. It depends. I personally would pick off flowers on a small plant like that. But once they're transplanted in the garden, I would not pick off flowers at all. Indeterminate varieties are going to grow until frost kills them or disease kills them, and so you're going to have a plethora of flowers and fruit anyway. So I don't think there's any reason to pick them off. If the plant is small, like you started from seed and it's now in a 4-inch pot, to encourage the root system to really grow, and it has flowers on it, I would take them off. But generally, a plant that small won't have flowers yet. They're going to have to be a little bit taller before they'd start producing, getting to the flower protection stage.
Now, I have heard and seen on the internet people who talk about pruning the flowers off tomatoes for staking purposes if they're tying it to a single stake. But everything I've read about that seems to imply that way you'll get earlier tomatoes, not necessarily more tomatoes. And you look at the research from places like Cornell University, and they just say, well, if you prune off the flowers, you're going to have fewer tomatoes.
Right. Typically, what I have read on the internet about pruning tomato plants is more of pruning the foliage. If you're growing on a stake or something like that, you don't want to have this huge, robust, indeterminate plant that would take over your yard on a single stake. And so you start pruning some of the branches. We have not done that out here. We prefer to grow them in a tomato cage and let them just grow rampant. The only time we do any pruning of foliage is anything that's touching the ground. So we'll prune off any leaves or branches that are down low touching the ground. And if we have a variety that is super dense and you can hardly get inside to get the fruit, we might do a little bit of pruning that way. And then at the end of the season, well, toward August or so, we'll start pruning the tops of the plants. We don't want it to set more fruit. It's now August, pushing into September. We want all the energy going into ripening the fruit that's already on there, so we'll give them a haircut along the top, because our plants won't stay in past much September, early October anyway.
Well, yeah, and that's pruning off stems in order to halt production. The other thing about removing foliage, too, you don't want your tomatoes exposed to the full sun, especially here in California, especially the south-facing and west-facing sides of the tomato. They can take a beating if there's no foliage to protect them.
That's absolutely correct. A lot of the information that I find on the internet, even if it's from university sites, are on the East Coast, where they don't have the intense sun that we have. So in the Sacramento area, because our summer afternoon sun is so intense and we have a lot of heat, we need as much foliage as we can to protect the fruit. A lot of the fruit will be outside the cages, so it's good to have the extra foliage. I even provide shade cloth occasionally.
So, George, there you go. Don't prune off those flowers. Put those shears away.
You've heard me talk about the benefits of Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric container. Smart Pots are sold around the world and are proudly made 100% right here in the USA. Smart Pots is the oldest and still the best of all the fabric plant containers that you might find. Many of the imitators are selling cheaply made fabric pots that fall apart quickly. Not Smart Pots. There are satisfied Smart Pot owners who have been using the same Smart Pots for over a decade, actually approaching 20 years. When you choose Smart Pot fabric containers, you know you'll be having a superior growing experience with the best product on the market. And your plants will appreciate Smart Pots too. Because of the 1 million microscopic holes in Smart Pots, your soil will have better drainage and the roots will be healthier. They won't be going round and round on the outside of the soil ball like you see in so many plastic pots. The air pruning qualities of Smart Pots creates more branching of the roots, filling more of the usable soil in the Smart Pot. Smart Pots are available at independent garden centers and select Ace and True Value hardware stores nationwide. To find a store near you or to buy online, visit smartpots.com/Fred. And don't forget that /Fred part. On that page are details about how, for a limited time, you can get 10% off your Smart Pot order by using the coupon code FRED. Use it at checkout from the Smart Pot store. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pots lightweight, colorful, award-winning fabric containers. And don't forget that special Farmer Fred 10% discount. Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred.
You're listening to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, and this is Greatest Hits Volume 2, where we take a look at the most listened to segments that occurred on episode 100 through 199. And don't worry, the podcast will be over before you have to go to bed, we hope. One of the segments featured, of course, Debbie Flower, America's favorite retired college horticultural professor. And true to the name, Garden Basics, the topic for this conversation, Debbie, was starting your first garden. Some pointers on that.
Right.
If I could grab a beginning gardener and tell them anything, it would be, don't let your eyes get bigger than your tummy.
Right. Start small.
Yeah.
Start with a few things and observe the size of the mature plant. I've seen so many people who want a garden and they start a garden, they're very enthusiastic. It's wonderful to see. And they bring home the tomato and the pepper and the squash, and they put them all in about a square foot space. Well, in no time, they're going to overgrow each other. So know how big the plant is going to become when it is mature. And if you only get a height, assume it will get equally as wide. And then space them so that they can have good airflow. So if they touch each other, it's just barely.
The other concept, and this is a radical concept, I realize, read the seed packet or read the tag that comes with the plant. It'll tell you how far to space them apart.
It will. It will at least tell you on a seed packet to plant the seeds a certain distance apart and then thin to a bigger distance apart. And that's how far apart they think the plants should be for good growth. Most gardens, summer plants need full sun, and make sure you have a good source of water.
First garden. Let's give a listen.
And if you're looking at landscape plants rather than annuals or things you're going to grow from seed, you need to look at the size the plant is going to be when it's mature. That's typically on the tag. If not, you're going to have to look the plant up and find out how tall and wide it's going to become. Sometimes you only learn how tall it's going to become, then you assume it will be equally as wide, and then space them in the garden so that they will, at maturity, not run into each other. Maybe they'll touch. That's what you have to decide, where your path is going to be. Where do you want to be able to walk between the plants? Where can the plants touch? But you need to give them enough space to get big enough.
Exactly.
A friend of mine is a landscape architect, and I asked her when I was teaching if there was one thing she could say to people when they are planting their gardens or yards, what would it be? And her number one thing was space the plants far enough apart. More problems are created by them being too close together than anything else. And I'm guilty of that as well, planting too close together, because it's so easy to do. When you buy them, they're so small and cute and they look so pretty together. And having these wide spaces between them doesn't make a lot of sense. But space them for their health and for the future of your garden.
And not only is it healthier for the plant, it also can keep bad pests and diseases away as well, because when you cut down air circulation by planting too close together, especially if you live in an area of high humidity, you could have all sorts of disease issues that could be mitigated by allowing air to circulate freely through those plants.
Absolutely true. Yes.
And when you're walking around your yard figuring out what you want to plant and where you want to put it, go inside the house and look out the windows. And think about where you spend most of your time indoors and which windows you're going to be looking out. And think about what you want to stare at for the rest of your life out those windows. And especially if you have a kitchen window, the vegetable garden, the fruit trees, the food products should be within easy view of that kitchen window.
Yes, when I initially laid the hardscape in this landscape we're sitting in right now, the landscaper suggested putting the vegetable garden in a place I would not see it from the patio or any window. And I said, no, I have to be able to see it on a regular basis, so I tend it.
Keep that in mind, too, when you're planting the garden. Do some sitting inside and look out and think about what you want to see that's out there. And remember that taller plants closer to your window may block the view of whatever's behind it. So if you want a complete view of the yard, if you're going to put in those trees or those shrubs, you may want to stick those further out so you can see the rest of your garden. Or if you're trying to protect some privacy, then you would want those taller plants closer to the window.
Or you can create rooms and create a space that where you see, it makes your landscape feel bigger. If you create where you can only see a small area and then you have to walk around a plant to see the next area in your garden. Lots of different ways. I love the looking out the window idea as a way to design the garden. I don't necessarily want to see my neighbor's house when I look outside the window, and so I've done lots of view blocking by planting trees and evergreen shrubs in places that will block those views.
When you're planting your garden, one thing to keep in mind is, where's the water faucet? How big of a chore is it going to be to water that garden? And this is where planning may require some pencil and paper, because you may want to lay out an irrigation system, perhaps even a drip irrigation system.
You may want that, and in our dry California climate, that's almost a must. But I've lived in places that get rain year-round, and in that case, we just needed to be near a hose bib. But we still needed to be near that hose bib instead of dragging it, 50 feet across from the back of the garage over to the vegetable garden. So having that in place is critical.
Looking to grow a naturally sweet treat? A family of fruits that are also one of the healthiest to snack on? It's berries. Blackberries, blueberries, boysenberries, and raspberries. No wonder that one of the most listened to episodes in the recent past is episode 182 of the Garden Basics podcast. It was all about berries. Sacramento County Master Gardener and longtime berry grower Pam Bone took us on a tour of her backyard berry patch, where we lingered among the raspberries.
How adaptable are raspberries to the United States? Are there zone limitations?
Some people would tell you that they can't grow raspberries in Sacramento, that they have a really horrible time. And we've been growing raspberries here at our house for practically the whole time we've lived here, which is nearly 42 years. And there are certain varieties for certain locations. So you have to know what will do well here. You also have to know kind of location they require too. How much sun can they take? You have to have sun in order to produce the berry itself. But here in our area, we have been planting Heritage and Oregon 1030, and those are varieties that are adapted to the heat. And the Heritage variety is still available everywhere. My daughter grows Heritage in Washington, in Pullman, Washington. So these are what we call the fall bearers or ever bearers, and they are a little bit different variety than the kind that you put up on a trellis and all, which actually they're much easier to prune and that. So yes, just go to your local cooperative extension or your nursery and find out what varieties are adapted to your area and what are their growth habit, and do you want that kind of growth habit? How much work are you willing to do with training them and pruning them and everything? So we've adapted very well here and produce huge crops of berries.
Raspberries, harvest time is when, and how do you harvest them, and how long can you store them?
Well, the berries, this particular variety, now remember, these are the two-crop variety, and a lot of people may grow raspberries that only produce a spring crop. This one also produces the fall crop.
It's Heritage, right?
Heritage is the one that you can find in the nurseries now, and it's pretty much everywhere. I think they sell it all over the United States. That particular variety then will start bearing a crop in late May, early June, and we'll get a pretty good crop then. In fact, actually, it might even be mid-May this year. It looks like some of the flowers are getting pretty well developed already at the ends. Now, this is a flower fruiting cycle where these are the old canes from last year that were cut down, and then the new growth that you see here is all from last year. As soon as these bear here in about another month and a half or so, then they are going to die back. And then all the new canes arising from below that are going to come up, they're going to produce then a fall crop. And I will say that it's kind of unpredictable, but most of the time our, quote, fall crop, and I should say fall with quotes around it because really the crop starts in August. And it'll go till Thanksgiving easily. in our area unless we get a really cold snap.
So when that stem has produced berries, that stem should be removed?
We usually wait until it starts to look really dead and looks like it's not productive at all. And then we, cut it out. And the reason is we used to just leave them, but we found out that we had that mite problem when we had a little bit of drought stress. And we found that if it's too crowded, you don't get the air circulation, the leaves get dusty and dry, and mites love that. And we just found that it was easier just to remove it, open it up, and get rid of it. And then it left a lot of opportunity for the rest of the canes to come up and grow. And then those come up, then they fruit, and we get a great crop. I say the heaviest crop is mid-August to the end of September, a great crop. And I put up a lot of jam. So my husband has to pick. He does all the picking. I do all the putting up. My husband calls himself the gardener. I'm the horticulturist. We used to work together on a lot of this stuff, but now he's got me in the kitchen, putting all this stuff up. He then will harvest about every 5 days, because if you don't, two things will happen. The fruit will get soft and mushy, and then it'll stop producing. But the soft and mushy attracts a fruit fly that goes to our cherry trees as well here. And we haven't had a real problem the last few years if you're really careful with keeping it up. But sometimes if you let that particular fruit fly go wild here, it will infest the fruit with unknown little white maggots until you're making your jam, and all of a sudden there they are. So, and especially the fall crops. So we have to be really careful and really religious about getting rid of any fruit that's too soft or decayed or whatever. And
picking the raspberries, can you pluck them or do you have to cut them?
No, in these you just pull right off. They pull off very easily, and not a problem at all. And in fact, when we get down to the boysenberries, same thing. You can just pull them right off. You don't have to cut anything. And they're very easy to pick. They're not too, they're a little bit thorny, but, a little bit of prickles on them, but not too bad.
What does Mike the gardener use to store the raspberries as he's picking them? Does he have a big bag, or is he just carrying a bucket?
So what I do is I like them because to be in a colander. And so I have a lot of large metal colanders and some plastic colanders. That way there's more broad surface area. He brings them into the house then, and I kind of make sure that they are well distributed because I put them in the refrigerator. And actually, raspberries have a very, very long refrigerator life. They can easily stay in a refrigerator without having to put them up to do anything with them for 5 to 7 days and not see any decay or anything, as long as you've picked them without already having a problem with a soft fruit. I try to get to them, though, and put them up if I can within about 2 to 3 days. But if something happens and I get a little behind, it's really producing heavily, I can leave some of them in there. It works out really well, actually.
Anything else you want to mention about raspberries?
Well, I think raspberries are pretty easy to grow, and they're easy to prune and take care of. They produce a beautiful crop and make fabulous jam. You just have to be careful to attention for making sure you mulch, making sure that they don't ever suffer any kind of a drought. Keep them irrigated evenly without too much water. They are sensitive to root rot, and our soil is a heavy clay soil, and we do have a type of Phytophthora in our soil that does infect our raspberries occasionally. And we then, I've had it actually identified at a state lab to make sure. So what we do is we just make sure that we pull those out occasionally. And then I really watch the irrigation, make sure that we're not keeping it too wet or whatever. But we're still going to get a little bit of it because it's in our soil. And you've got a heavy clay soil, and even just normal spring or winter rains or whatever keeps the soil wet. And as soon as that fungus gets active, then you have to be careful not to keep it too wet. And so it's kind of walking a little bit of a fine line there with the irrigation. But otherwise, they're pretty carefree. Once a year fertilization is it, and the pruning doesn't take much time. And I highly recommend raspberries. They're fabulous, and they taste really good.
You want to start the backyard fruit and nut orchard of your dreams, but maybe you don't know where to begin. Or maybe you're currently growing fruit and nut trees and you've got a million questions, such as what are the tastiest fruits to grow? Where can I go to buy some of these delectable fruit and nut trees you've been reading about?
And then how do you care for all of these trees, including planting, pruning, and harvesting? I've got one online stop in mind for you where all these questions you might have will get answered. It's DaveWilson.com. That's Dave Wilson Nursery, the nation's largest wholesaler of fruit and nut trees for the backyard garden. They have planting tips, taste test results, and links to nurseries in your area that carry Dave Wilson fruit trees. Click on the Home Garden tab at DaveWilson.com for all of these links, including a link to their years of informative videos about growing fruit and nut trees that they've posted on the Dave Wilson Nursery YouTube channel. Start the backyard orchard of your dreams at DaveWilson.com. Another segment that made the Greatest Hits Part 2 had to do with the best tomatoes for containers. And that, again, was a subject Debbie Flower and I discussed a while back. Probably the best tomatoes for containers are those tomatoes that probably don't get very big, Debbie.
Right. There are tomatoes that only get to about 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, maybe 3 feet wide. They should be caged. I have them in the ground right now, and they're not caged yet because I don't have the cages yet. But they should be caged. They can flop over as well. There's something called the Dwarf Tomato Project, and you can Google that, and you can get seeds from those people, and they are growing tomatoes that stay small. They still produce decent-sized fruit, not giant fruit, but decent-sized fruit that tastes good, and they've been bred for flavor as well as for small plant size. And so there's a whole bunch of tomatoes in that project.
It's the Dwarf Tomato Project, a subsidiary of Snow White Industries. So we'll go check that out. But listen to what we had to say about the best tomatoes for containers that attracted such a big audience. This question comes from on the Farmer Fred Facebook page. I was talking about tomatoes, about good award-winning tomatoes to plant in your garden. Mm-hmm. And a reader had the question, what are the best container tomatoes?
That's a good question.
Oh, Debbie Flower is here. Our favorite retired college horticultural professor. Yeah. Debbie, maybe some general guidelines for tomatoes in containers. I would think they need to be small.
Right. That would be the number one criteria, is that they're not going to get too big. Some tomatoes can get 12, 15 feet tall and spread 4 or 5 feet wide. And that's not the tomato that you want to grow in the container. Use a big container, 15-gallon container. You'll read in some places they say you can do it in smaller, and you can for a while, and then your tomato will peter out. So if you want a good long season out of that tomato, use a 15-gallon or a half barrel would be really good. Make sure there are drainage holes in the bottom. Yes. And then you pick a tomato, and in your tomato list, Fred, you put tomato vocabulary, and that's a very useful thing to have, because one word you in particular want to look for is determinate. Determinate means the tomato will stop growing at a certain size. They're often used in the canning industry, grown in the field. They don't always need to be caged or staked, and they produce a lot of fruit all at once. But they do continue to produce. So it isn't a once and done kind of plant. So you will have a long season of growing. You'll just have a whole bunch of tomatoes right at the beginning, and then you'll have continuous production after that.
A little bit slower production.
A little bit slower. So determinate is one word we want to look for. Another is bush. Bush plants, tomato plants are typically determinants, but they're often the small end of the determinate scale. There are some determinate plants that can get very large.
Yeah, most though, probably around 2-3 feet tall.
The bushes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Using those terms, you've got the bush all-star, the bush champion, the early girl bush. There are some plants that are even named things like patio. So that gives you a hint that the plant is really meant to be in a container. For a sauce plant, if you want tomatoes for sauce, really meaty tomatoes, the Roma is an old reliable determinate plant. And so if you're going to Google, use these terms. Use determinate, bush. Look for those other names that indicate that it would be kind of small, like a patio. You can get some really small tomatoes, ones that only grow about a foot by a foot.
They plants, not the fruit.
The plants, yes.
If you remember blogs, remember when blogs were popular? Mine still exists out there in the blogosphere, the Farmer Fred Rant blog page. And one of the more popular ones is called Fall and Winter Tomatoes from Your Greenhouse. I spent a couple of years attempting to grow tomatoes in a greenhouse during the winter, and you obviously have limited space in hobby greenhouses. So I was growing them in 5 and 15-gallon containers, and I was choosing determinate varieties that would ripen fairly quickly, usually within 55 to 65 days, which for a tomato is pretty darn quick.
It is very quick.
But there are plenty of varieties available. Among the ones that I planted that I had success with, as you mentioned, Bush Early Girl, the Bush Beefsteak, and some heirloom tomatoes like Grashofka, Manitoba, others like Oregon Spring, Pilgrim. 2 of the ones of the smaller tomatoes that actually really did quite well, Polar Baby and Prairie Fire. One more, the 506 Bush, also did quite well. Now, the problem with growing tomatoes in the greenhouse in the wintertime, in a greenhouse that you keep above 60 degrees or so, so you got the energy bill to think about there. The taste. It's a notch above supermarket level. Do you want to put that much
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work to get something that's just slightly better than a supermarket tomato, but the thing is, you grew it yourself.
Right.
And the thing is, you're going to get white flies.
Well, yes. Yeah. I was going to ask you about that. Notice that a lot of the names of the tomatoes you mentioned, not all of them, but indicate coldness. Manitoba, Polar, Silets, which is a place in Oregon, Siberia. There's another term, I don't know, didn't check if it was on your list, parthenocarpic. Parthenocarpic means producing without pollination. It's like a navel orange, never gets pollinated, it just produces fruit. It's like a false pregnancy.
So it's a perfect flower?
It's just they do flower, navel oranges, but they don't get pollinated. They just produce a fruit. It's like a false pregnancy. And there are parthenocarpic tomatoes, there are parthenocarpic cucumbers. They won't have seeds in them, and they don't need to be pollinated, so you don't have to have bees in your greenhouse to produce the fruit.
I had a fan to move it around.
And you shook the tables.
Yeah, and I shook the tables.
Yeah. Which tomatoes can be self-pollinating, meaning that if temperatures and growing conditions are right, their pistil and stamen will pass each other at just the right time to transfer pollen and cause fruit to form.
I used to use old battery-operated bedroom toys, too, for pollination purposes. And it works. You can actually see the pollen move around when you touch a branch.
Toothbrushes, electric toothbrushes.
Yeah, those things. Yeah, sure. But, yes, there are a lot of good container tomatoes of a good size. You just got to shop carefully.
You do. Got to read those seed packets or read the description in the catalog.
It's Garden Basics Greatest Hits Volume 2. The countdown continues. This time around, one of the most listened to episodes went to Emily Murphy. She's author of the book Grow Now, and she was telling us a lot about how to take care of your soil, about regenerative gardening, but basically how a healthy soil leads to healthier plants. And one technique that she talked about was foregoing rototilling, which does more damage than good to the underground biology of your soil. But the practice of no-till isn't just for your bare ground. In this chat with Emily Murphy, she explained how keeping your soil undisturbed as much as possible can be applied to your raised beds and your container plants. She calls it no-dig, and she talks about a way to build up your soil without having to purchase bags or yards of potting mix, and she calls that lasagna gardening.
And the other way to tackle no-dig is not just by growing in the ground, but it's also to use no-dig techniques in raised beds and containers. The idea there is that instead of sourcing soil, say for a raised bed, a larger bed, the typical rule of thumb is to use 50-50 compost to topsoil. That's kind of the general rule of thumb for filling raised beds. That's fine. Oftentimes, soil is sourced from places that have been excavated for building sites and whatnot, so it's already getting moved. But when you think about it, soil does have to come from somewhere, and it's disturbing soil somewhere else where it's then, when it's excavated, releases carbon to the atmosphere, disturbs that soil ecosystem, which is valuable to wherever that soil came from. Instead of moving soil from one place to another, also takes a lot of fossil fuels, right, to move a heavy load of soil. Instead, we can compost in place and use lasagna gardening or hugelkultur, which is a German word for layering organic matter, in place, sort of in situ, and planting in that. And I show how to do that in Grow Now. It's a really simple technique. It's the same technique I use to fill my raised beds. If anyone follows me on social media, you'll see the garden that I built a year ago this month, and I filled them with this lasagna gardening technique. And it's composting. Sticks and twigs on the bottom. So you have your layer of browns, layer of greens, layer of browns. And I saved the fine compost for the top. I did have to bring in compost because it was a new garden, and I didn't have time to make any, but I sourced it locally. I'm really lucky. I have West Marin compost is not far from here. It's about a mile away. I saved that fine compost for the soil surface and planted in it. And 3 months later, I had this incredible start of summer garden, and you can plant intensively. And it's so simple and so empowering. The technique, you're right. Okay, you don't want to wag your finger at someone and say, don't do that. I agree. But at the same time, wow, what a gift to be given to these techniques. Make it so easy and immediately get you off on the right foot towards success.
In those raised beds, do you even have to fertilize the plants?
I didn't. I didn't. And the only thing I do is I add, this last year, I added compost to a few places. Otherwise, I put in a cover crop of fava beans where I wasn't growing greens. I will add a layer of compost with manures in it this spring. And I'm in the process of doing that. I'm a little behind because of the release of Grow Now. Grow Now came out February 1st. And as you can imagine, it's been a wild ride with the bookmaking, and with anything in your garden, you have to prioritize. You don't have time for everything. And I've decided to focus on, since I have the veggie garden in place, I decided to put most of my attention towards the rewilding project out front, knowing that I can get to the veggie garden with time because I'm in California and the growing season's so long.
Exactly. Yes, indeed. Well, the benefits of just applying the mulch like you do, as it breaks down, it feeds the soil. And if it's one thing I say a lot on this podcast, you're not feeding plants, you're feeding the soil, which in turn will feed the plants. And
absolutely. That's exactly what I say as well. And that's what I say in Grow Now. You're really feeding the soil ecosystem, which you'll read and Grow Now. Part of the regenerative process is not just supporting biodiversity, but really beginning this decadal process of pulling carbon from the atmosphere underground. One of the studies I found so interesting when I started writing Grow Now was the study out of UC Davis. It was a 20-year study looking at the reality of sequestering carbon underground. Can we really do it? Does it really work? Do regenerative practices work to sequester carbon at depth and sequester stable carbon? And they found over this 20-year study, yes, it does. And they found, yes, keeping living roots in the ground, which is a tenet of regenerative growing as well, with the use of cover crops is vitally important. And that supports biodiversity. It keeps living roots in the ground, and those roots feed the soil as well through the root exudates, which is a big term, but it's described in Grow Now. But more importantly, it was the application of compost, of feeding the soil compost, that really drove this carbon sequestration process. And what the writers of the research said was, they said that it could even be a half an inch to an inch of compost over a landscape that has the power to sequester carbon. And when we approach our landscapes then with this layer of compost and a no-dig approach, we're able to maintain those carbon stores underground in a stable fashion for many, many years. Now, it can take time. It's, again, a decadal process, but it's possible. And the benefits are immediate because when we feed the soil, we're feeding the biodiversity in the soil and the soil ecology, which then feeds our plants, helps us grow gardens much easier. The soil is doing much of the work for us, keeping our plants resilient, and feeds the ecology above the ground in many ways because there's this feed forward loop.
So I would imagine, since you talked about lasagna gardening, that this compost layer goes on top of your soil, and then you're covering that with some sort of mulch in order to keep, say, flying weed seeds from germinating in that very fine compost.
Absolutely. And the type of mulch you use depends upon what you plan to grow. So we were talking about rules of thumb earlier. The typical rule of thumb with the mulch you choose is based upon what it is you're growing. So if you're growing trees and shrubs, particularly native trees and shrubs, the idea is to mulch with materials that are similar to, that are, mulch that's made up of materials that are similar to the plants you're growing. And so it can be more woody debris, leaves, as the primary source of compost making or mulch making. But with a veggie garden, you want to use a compost that is, or for a veggie garden, when you're prepping for a veggie garden, you want to use a compost that is more in keeping with the plants you're going to grow again. So a compost that's been made out of kitchen scraps, for instance, or kitchen scraps and leaves and other organic materials, that a compost that has been fed kitchen scraps. And I think that's a pretty easy parallel to follow when you're considering, well, which type of mulch should I use? And that's one place to start. And of course, whatever's local is also a really good place to start.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
If you can source it in your own garden or your neighbor's garden, if your neighbor has leaves, wonderful. Use those leaves.
How many times have we said, read and follow all label directions? But how many of you have actually read through the pages and pages of instructions that come with some of the most popular weed killers on the market? In the Friday, June 10th edition of the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter, we highlight some of the most important passages in those instructions that you might have missed. Instructions that can help keep your desirable plants alive after you've applied that weed killer. And we chat with Debbie Flower about the best ways to kill weeds organically, and that's with soil solarization. And now's the time to do it. It's all in the newsletter that goes beyond the basics, the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred Beyond the Basics newsletter, and it comes out Friday, June 10th. Find it via the link in today's show notes or visit our new website, gardenbasics.net. There you can find a link to the newsletter in the tabs on the top of the page. And you can also listen to any of the previous editions of the podcast, as well as read an enhanced transcript of the podcast episode that you're listening to now. It's at gardenbasics.net, where you can also link to the Garden Basics newsletter, Beyond the Basics. And it's free. Look for it on Friday, June 10th. So take a deeper dive into gardening with the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter. Find it at gardenbasics.net. Here on the Garden Basics podcast, we like to compile a greatest hits episode every now and then. And now that we are into the 200s, why not take a look back at the most listened to segments that occurred between episodes 100 and 199. One of those talked about composting, and we were discussing composting with Debbie Flower, America's favorite retired college horticultural professor. Debbie, composting, everybody should do some sort of composting.
Yes, everybody should do some sort of composting. And that's a good point. There are different kinds of composting. There's composting your yard waste, and then there's composting your kitchen waste. And to compost your kitchen waste, there's worm composting, or there's kind I like, which is lazy green cone composters, or there are new machines out that will do it for you. And for your yard composting, there's so much advice. But the number one thing in yard composting the compost pile needs is air. So turning it will get you compost faster than anything else.
And oddly enough, when you turn the compost pile, it also gets warmer.
Yeah, because the microorganisms that are in there breaking down the waste you've piled up need oxygen to survive as well. And so they can reproduce better.
It's Composting Tips, part of Garden Basics Greatest Hits Volume 2. Let's give a listen. Well, that brings us to a scenic bypass that I wanted to get into with you. And they cut down 3 eucalyptus trees in a neighbor's yard. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm out there going, what are you going to do? You don't want to ship all that wood chips away. Why don't you just dump some of it in my driveway? Mm-hmm. And he goes, okay. And it turns out he had a really big chipper, shredder, and truck. And the pile in my driveway that I still have to get back to finish, it's like 10 yards.
Wow.
And that's a lot of stuff.
It is a lot of stuff.
So I'm wondering, how hot does it get in a compost pile? So I took a picture, and I'll have this picture posted at the Garden Basics newsletter of the eucalyptus mulch, the chipped, and it's really pretty. And it smells great, too.
Yeah.
I stuck my compost thermometer, which is a thermometer gauge with a 30-inch probe on it. Mm-hmm. You stick that in the compost pile, and it was a 50-degree day, and the temperature on the compost, and it might have gone up if I left it in there longer. I only left it in there about 20 minutes, but the temperature got up to 100 degrees.
And how long had that pile been there?
2 days.
2 days, okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So it was starting to compost. You were starting a hot compost.
Why? Why does that happen? Why is there a 50-degree difference between the air temperature and what's going on in the middle of a compost pile? Are there kids in there playing with matches?
Kind of.
Yeah.
There's life in there. Yeah. There are microorganisms. So micro means things we have to see with a microscope. We have to see under magnification. Microorganisms, algae, fungi, bacteria that are living off of the chipped wood. And they are biological organisms, and they create heat just like a human body does. As they're active, they give off heat, and that helps them live, and it helps other things move in, and it helps, their presence also helps, and their heat helps to kill the bad things in a compost pile.
Okay, so it isn't a chemical. It isn't like nitrogen breaking down or something like that.
Well, it is in the sense that the microorganisms are chewing on the wood, which, although it's very high in carbon, it does contain nitrogen.
Yeah.
They need both carbon and nitrogen to survive. And so it is nitrogen breaking down and it's carbon breaking down, but it's through the process of these live organisms.
And you make a very good point, too, about the carbon-nitrogen ratio and how important that is to a hot compost pile. If you see instructions for building a compost pile, they'll always tell you to alternate a layer of brown with a layer of green. The brown being carbon, green being any sort of green matter, is your nitrogen source.
Yes.
In this particular pile that's still sitting in my driveway, the section I stuck the compost thermometer in was mostly the chips from the trunk of the tree. If I had stuck it in the other side of the pile where it was mostly the leaves, it probably would have been hotter.
Yes.
I should have done that.
If you get arborist chips from a tree that has had leaves on it at the time it was removed, or tree portions that had leaves on it at the time it was removed, you've typically got a really good carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's supposed to be something like 30 carbon to 1 nitrogen to have a hot compost pile.
And a hot compost pile could be what, 140 degrees?
140 is ideal. That kills everything. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. My dad used to mow the lawn, collect the clippings. This is way back when, folks, before we knew about mulching mowers, and put them in the garbage can, and then he had a compost thermometer as well, and stick it in the garbage can and sit there and watch. That is almost total. It's not total nitrogen, but it's a very high nitrogen ratio compared to the carbon, and it is not great for composting, but it quickly becomes hot, and then it becomes slime after that.
Which reminds me that probably in the show notes and in the Garden Basics newsletter that will accompany this episode, I'll have a link to a formula for creating a hot compost pile in as little as 3 weeks. Dr. Bob Robbie of UC came up with this formula that by gauging the size of the pile and turning it frequently, you can have ready-to-use compost in as little as 3 weeks.
Well, I beat him.
Did you?
Yes. I had a crew. I had students.
Oh.
We did it in 2 weeks. I worked for the Sac City School District at a vocational high school for adults, and we maintained the landscape as part of the horticulture training. And we had a little chipper. Boy, people had to work long and hard to get this stuff broken down. But we didn't pay attention to ratio of carbon to nitrogen. We just took whatever we had and chipped it and threw it. We had a concrete pad up against a brick building. So we threw it in a pile up against this building, and every day, 5 days a week, we went out and the students took the pile and moved it from one place to another. Next day, the same thing. Took it back. Next day, turned it back. We had compost in 2 weeks. The number one limiting factor in a compost pile is oxygen, to keep those microorganisms alive. People think it's water. Yes, it has to be moist, but moist, not wet. They think it might be nitrogen. You need nitrogen, but not a lot of it. The number one thing, and there was a organization in Tucson, Arizona that was studying composting, and they came up with the same answer, that the number one, so Tucson, Arizona is a very hot, very dry place, and they watered the compost pile and they added the right or the wrong carbon to nitrogen ratio, but the number one limiting factor in the compost pile was oxygen.
Yeah, and you see sometimes when you're looking at instructions for creating a compost pile, you might see a suggestion to add nitrogen fertilizer or sprinkle it with water every day.
Right.
But it's more important just to turn it to increase the oxygen.
Yes. Then if you look around, you'll find devices with like PVC pipes that go under the compost pile with holes in them that blow air, blah, blah, blah. But really, that would help. But as the components of the compost pile break down, they get smaller and smaller and smaller. So the spaces between particles get smaller and smaller and smaller as they nestle closer and closer together. And by turning it, you open up those spaces and you allow more oxygen into the pile, which allows the microorganisms to work faster and allows the carbon and nitrogen to break down faster.
Were these in constructed bins? I mentioned that because Dr. Bob Robbie's formula was a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot bin that was open, and you would turn that pile into another bin like that. So what was the size of the pile?
The ones in Tucson were in bins like that.
Yeah.
And that is the minimum size, 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot.
Yeah.
That's a cubic yard. Mm-hmm. And that is you need a certain amount of insulation. The stuff on the outside is not going to break down because it's not insulated well enough. And so you need a certain amount of insulation on the outside to allow the center to warm up. The pile it was called the Skills Center where I taught, was bigger than that. But we just shoveled it, used shovels to move it from one corner to another corner.
Okay. And you had plenty of help.
Yeah, that was the good part.
So thanks for listening to all the highlights of the Greatest Hits Volume 2 of the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast today. I appreciate it. And if any of those segments intrigued you want more information, go to the show notes where you can find links to the entire episode that these segments were taken from. Once again, it was you, the listeners, who put together today's Greatest Hits Volume 2 based on download totals, unique listeners, and time consumed. Again, for episodes 100 through 199. And next time around, I promise you a podcast of 30 minutes or less. I'll try. I'll really try. Thank you. Garden Basics with Farmer Fred comes out every Tuesday and Friday, and it's brought to you by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. Garden Basics, it's available wherever podcasts are handed out. For more information about the podcast, visit our website, gardenbasics.net. And that's where you can find out about the free Garden Basics newsletter, Beyond the Basics. And thank you so much for listening. Can you hear in your headphones?
I can.
Okay. I can barely hear in my headphones. What's going on here?
Should I shout?
No! All right. There. Seeing how you're sitting right there. Maybe if I turn this up instead. 1, 2, 3.
Louder, yeah.
Yeah, there. Yeah. All right, fine. We'll see where we go from here.